Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
George Washington in retirement, that raises an interesting question because George Washington retired frequently. He retired the first time, or at least threatened to, when he was serving in the Virginia militia. He wasn't getting the supplies he thought he needed out on the frontier to defend the Virginians from marauding tribes. And so he headed off to Williamsburg to threaten to quit. He said, "I will resign." He threatened to quit when he wasn't being compensated appropriately in comparison with British generals, or British officers, I should say, not generals, because he thought he, as a colonel in the militia, ought to have equivalent standing to those appointees of the king. And if he wasn't going to get it, he would quit. He retired in 1783. When the Revolutionary War ended, he retired, and he said when he retired, "I have now spent 8 years in my public service at great personal sacrifice. I want nothing else but to spend the rest of my life in repose on my own land. I will be undisturbed. I will not meddle in public things again." Well, of course, that only lasted through 1787. When he was called to the Constitutional Convention and then subsequently to the presidency. So when 1796 comes and he retires definitively, not that he isn't called on again, he is called once more, but he doesn't go. But when he is definitively in retirement in 1796, it is to return to Mount Vernon. It is to enjoy what had never been out of his mind. Sometimes we think all these retirements were dramatic, histrionic. Is Washington playing a part. But what we neglect is the extent to which he paid attention through all those years of public service to Mount Vernon. He gave detailed instructions to managers about the care of his estate, his farms, and all his properties. He was always anxious about what was going on there through the Revolutionary War, through the time in Washington. He couldn't give enough attention to it. George Washington was a real farmer. There was once an exchange between Washington and Thomas Jefferson in 1796 after they had become estranged because of political partisanship, in which Jefferson, this was leading up to the election, of course, to succeed Washington, and so Jefferson was trying to clear the path, and he wrote a letter to Washington and he said, "Look, I have the greatest respect for you. I've not been involved in any of these partisan attacks. I just want to assure you that there is no animus on my part." And then Jefferson spoke at some length about his agricultural interests, because we all know what a scientist Thomas Jefferson was. Washington responded to the letter, ignored all the protestations about political innocence, and wrote at great length about farming, agriculture, as if to say, "I'll show you who the real farmer is." So when he retires, he really does step right back into it without missing a stride of making sure his properties are well tended and successful. And that has a lot to do with his pulling things back into order sufficient to enable him in his last will and testament to make the provisions that he makes for the slaves as well as for his family members as he had reconstituted, rebuilt his estate. His retirement years were also punctuated by watching political decline. At one point, Jonathan Trumbull writes a letter to him. This is in 1798. And he says, "You've got to get back in the game. We're going to lose this next election. The Federalists were divided. Adams was just not effective. We don't know where to turn. We need you." Washington wrote back and he said, "If it's men and not principles you need, in order to be able to stand and sustain the republic, then it's not worth sustaining. So he would not come back. He was finally, definitively retired.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.